Tori Stafford was 8 years old in April 2009 when, while walking home from school, she was lured into a vehicle by Terri-Lynne McClintic. McClintic drove the little girl to a field where Stafford was viciously abused, murdered, and buried by McClintic and her boyfriend. Almost a decade later, the brutal murder of Tori Stafford continues to shock the conscience of Canadians. While her murderers may have been caught and brought to justice, recent news that McClintic has been transferred to a minimum security indigenous healing lodge has, for good reason, ignited anger around Stafford's tragic case. How could a self-confessed, convicted child murderer with a documented history of violence in prison move to such a low-security facility where children are present? Does this case point to a failure in our correction system? And what should the government be doing about this case and others like it? A recent commentary for MLI by former Crown Prosecutor Scott Newark takes a hard look at all these questions. Newark argues that this case points to glaring issues that go right to the core of the Canadian corrections system. In the case of Terri-Lynne McClintic, these glaring errors could not be more obvious. She was originally placed in a maximum security prison in 2010, incarceration commensurate with her crimes. Despite being convicted of a violent assault against another inmate in 2012, by 2014 she was downgraded to a medium security prison. Earlier this year, she self-identified as Aboriginal and was transferred to the Okanaochi Healing Lodge. This transfer was done without the consultation of the relevant Indigenous community, without informing the family of the victim, and without any form of transparent, independent review. It was a closed-door decision that did not consider the savagery of McClintic's original crimes, the reason she was in custody to begin with. How could this happen? How could something so obviously shocking to the conscience of Canadians be allowed to occur? At its core, the problems have evolved gradually alongside a culture shift at the Correctional Service of Canada, or the CSC. Going back to the 1970s, Canada's criminal system has slowly shifted away from focusing on punishing criminals and protecting society. Instead, it now focuses much more on the rehabilitation of criminals. Although much of this shift has been positive, cases like McClintic's show that the adoption of this rehabilitation philosophy has resulted in serious, unforeseen consequences. The primary issue, Newark says, is that this rehabilitation focus by the CSC has resulted in an internal culture where offenders are now viewed as clients rather than convicted criminals. Additionally, the organization routinely now follows a one-size-fits-all approach that fails to distinguish between the different offenders based on their criminal history. Despite the quite reasonable anger that McClintic's case has elicited, the government has made the right move by resisting politicization. A direct intervention by politicians on a specific case, regardless of how appalling that case may be, would constitute an unauthorized and indeed unwise politicization of correctional operations that would also undermine the rule of law. However, this by no means should suggest that the government should sit on its hands. Now, the hard work begins to ensure that this kind of incident is not repeated in the future. Rather than making decisions on a case-by-case basis, we should instead look at the long-term changes that should be made to the legislation, regulations, and policies that underpin the Canadian corrections system. Some potential structural reforms could include the following: requiring that victims of particularly egregious crimes be notified when offenders are given security reduction or transfer. Providing victims with relevant offender information and the opportunity to make submissions in transfer decisions. including consideration of principles of sentencing in transfer decision-making, prohibiting offenders of particularly egregious crimes from being placed in dual medium minimum security facilities, mandating indigenous consultation for healing lodge transfer and consent for non-indigenous inmate transfer. These reforms are no panacea. Problems will persist, and more changes will be necessary to truly fix some of the deep issues within Canada's corrections system. More generally, while creating and maintaining a fair criminal justice system is a complex and difficult process, the government has the chance to take a balanced approach. The often competing interests of public safety, respect for victims, offender rehabilitation, and transparency and accountability are not either-or propositions, but rather are integral parts of a properly functioning system. Tori Stafford may have been denied adequate justice. The system may have failed to bring one of her killers to full account. However, it does not have to continue this way. The legacy of Tori Stafford can be the legacy of improvements to our criminal justice and corrections system, so that no future victims or victims' families will have to endure the plainly unfair treatment that the Staffords have endured. I'm Brian Lee Crowley for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.